The Jascon 4 rolled violently as a massive swell hammered the steel hull. 11 men would never see another. No one expected a routine tensioning. It was approximately 4:30 a.m. on May 26, 2013, roughly 30 kilometers off the coast of Escravos, Nigeria. The anchor-handling tugboat was performing a standard operation to stabilize a tanker during a ship-to-ship transfer of oil for Chevron when the Atlantic. Within seconds, the 12-man crew went from the rhythmic safety of their cabins to a nightmare of rushing salt water and inverted corridors. Most were trapped in their rooms as the ship flipped entirely upside down, turning their sleeping quarters into steel coffins. Harrison Okene, the ship's cook and a native of the Niger Delta, was thrown from his bunk into the pitch-black chaos. He had no time to grab a life vest or reach an emergency exit. The vessel was already plunging 30 meters toward the silty floor of the Gulf of Guinea. While his colleagues struggled against the rising tide in the belly of the ship, Harrison scrambled through the darkness, guided by nothing but instinct and the deafening roar of the ocean filling the voids of the vessel. Above, the surface was a churning mess of foam and debris, but below, the Jascon 4 was settling into a silent, lightless grave on the seabed. The Nigerian Maritime sector would later scrutinize the ship-turning protocols and weather assessments used that morning, but for the 11 men lost in those first chaotic minutes, the structural failures of the operation had already sealed their fate. Harrison found himself alone, submerged in the freezing dark, unaware that he was about to begin the most grueling test. The violent churn of the Atlantic eventually 30 meters below the surface. Harrison Okene found himself in a world where light ceased to exist. He was trapped in a small office near the officers' quarters, a space now inverted and flooded. The only thing standing between him and the crushing pressure of the Gulf of Guinea was a 4-foot pocket of air, caught like a desperate bubble against the floor that had become his ceiling. He was stripped to his boxers, his skin pebbled with the onset of hypothermia as his body heat drained into the relentless cold of the deep. Alone in the absolute blackness, he could hear the hull of the Jascon 4 groaning under the weight of the ocean, a metallic dirge for the 11 men who hadn't found a pocket of air. Then, a new sound emerged from the corridor outside his tiny sanctuary. It was the sound of splashing, followed by a rhythmic, sickening tearing. In the darkness, the scavengers of the deep, likely sharks or large barracuda, had found the wreckage, and they were beginning to feed on the remains of his crewmates. Harrison retreated as far into the corner of his air bubble as possible, standing chest-deep in the water where he knew the predators were circling. But there was one detail that didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. He had only a single bottle of Coca-Cola to sustain his strength, but his true enemy wasn't hunger. It was the air itself. With no ventilation, the oxygen was slowly depleting, replaced by the carbon dioxide he exhaled with every panicked breath. As the hours turned into days, the chemical composition of his tiny tomb was reaching lethal concentrations, clouding his mind and slowing his heart. He spent these 60 hours in a state of constant prayer, a Nigerian man holding on to his Christian faith while bracing for the moment the water would finally claim him. He was a man waiting for a funeral that had already begun, unaware that his presence in the wreck was about to challenge every protocol of maritime recovery. By the late afternoon of May 28, 2013, the timeline for human survival had long since been exceeded. 60 hours had passed since the Jascon 4 vanished beneath the swells of the Atlantic, and the mission coordinates had shifted from a desperate search to a somber recovery. DCN Diving, a specialized team of saturation divers, was called in to perform the chilling task of entering the wreckage to retrieve the remains of the 11 missing crew members. Stationed on the surface support vessel Toucan, Supervisor Colby Werrett coordinated the descent. The atmosphere on deck was professional but heavy with the weight of the tragedy. At a depth of 30 meters, the pressure was nearly 4 times that of the surface. and the water was a frigid, lightless void. Nico van Heerden, a South African diver, descended through the water column, his movements restricted by the thick umbilical. This was an industrial operation, guided by rigid safety protocols and the grim certainty that they were entering a graveyard. What started as a routine body recovery was about to become something entirely different. The divers moved through the churning silt and floating debris of the inverted ship, navigating a subterranean labyrinth where floors had become ceilings. The interior of the Jascon 4 was a scene of total devastation, with furniture, clothes, and ship equipment forming a hazardous obstacle course. Van Heerden's helmet camera broadcast a grainy, haunting feed back to the surface, showing his gloved hand reaching into the darkness. He was searching for the ship's cook and the other missing men, prepared for the psychological toll of handling the deceased. As he approached the galley and officers' quarters, the silence of the deep was... He saw what appeared to be a hand floating in the murky water, seemingly lifeless and pale. He moved toward it, reaching out to grasp the wrist, convinced he was beginning the first of many recoveries that day. He had no way of knowing that within the darkness of that inverted hull, a pocket of air and a desperate man were defying every law of maritime disaster. Nico van Heerden's dive light sliced through the murky, silt-choked corridors of the inverted Jascon 4. It was May 28, 2013, nearly 60 hours after the tug had vanished beneath the swells of the Gulf of Guinea. The air inside the wreck was... Van Heerden, a specialized saturation diver from DCN Diving, moved with the deliberate caution. He had already passed the remains of several crewmen, and the psychological weight of the recovery mission was palpable through the communications line back to the surface. As he navigated the officers' quarters, his light caught a glimpse of what looked like a limb. He reached into a small pocket of water toward what he assumed was another body to be bagged and brought home to grieving families. Then, the impossible happened. As Van Heerden's hand neared the surface of the water inside the air pocket, a pale, waterlogged hand suddenly reached out, and Van Heerden recoiled. A surge of pure adrenaline and on the surface in the control room of the support vessel, Shipwreck to Cannes, Supervisor Colby Werrett watched the grainy high-definition feed from Van Heerden's helmet camera. He heard the diver's sharp, panicked intake of breath and saw the frantic movement of the silt. For a terrifying moment, the team struggled to comprehend what was appearing on their monitors. They were prepared for but the hand didn't let go. It squeezed with a desperate, life-affirming strength. In the dim glow of the diver's lamp, the face of Harrison Okene finally emerged from the darkness. The Nigerian cook, his West African features strained by extreme exhaustion and the crushing pressure of the deep, stared back with eyes that had seen the abyss. The realization hit the dive team with profound force. This was no longer a recovery, but a high-stakes rescue operation. However, the discovery of a survivor at a depth of 30 meters after 3 days presented a catastrophic technical challenge. Okene was severely hypothermic, having spent 60 hours stripped to his boxers in the cooling Atlantic waters. More dangerously, the oxygen in his tiny 4-foot-high air pocket was nearly spent, replaced by carbon dioxide levels that were reaching lethal concentrations. If the divers attempted to bring him to the surface immediately, the nitrogen saturated in his tissues would expand violently, causing a fatal case of the bend. Van Heerden had to remain remarkably calm, comforting the shell-shocked survivor and fitting him with a specialized diving mask, while they began the slow, agonizing process of guiding Okene through the labyrinth of the wreckage toward the diving bell. But the most grueling part of this underwater nightmare was only just beginning. The transition from the freezing, oil-slicked darkness of the Jascon 4 to the surface was not a simple journey of ascent, but a grueling physiological battle. Because Harrison Okene had spent nearly 3 days at a depth of 30 meters, his body was saturated with nitrogen. A rapid return to the surface would have caused the gas to form lethal bubbles in his bloodstream, a condition known as... To save his life, The DCN diving team had to transfer him from the ship's hull into a diving bell and then into a pressurized decompression chamber on the surface support vessel, the Shipwreck Toucan. For another 60 hours, the same amount of time he had spent trapped in the air pocket, Okene remained a prisoner of pressure. It was only on May 31st, 2013, that the doors finally opened and he was able to breathe the natural air of the Nigerian coast again. The physical recovery was the beginning of a much longer psychological ordeal. Harrison returned to a world that hailed him as a living miracle, but he was haunted by the silence of the 11 men who did not come home, including the vessel. For years, he suffered from debilitating PTSD and night terrors, hearing the sounds of the wreck in his sleep and vowing he would never again set foot on a boat. However, the human spirit possesses a remarkable capacity for transformation. In a defiance of his own trauma, Okene returned to the very company that pulled him from the seabed. In 2015, he completed his training to become a professional commercial diver, receiving his diploma from DCN Diving. He chose to master the element that had nearly claimed him, turning a site of tragedy into a foundation for a new life. His survival led to a sweeping reevaluation of maritime safety protocols in the Gulf of Guinea, particularly regarding the stability of tugboats during high. Today, Harrison Okene's story remains a testament to the thin margin between life and death and the Subscribe so these stories are never forgotten. Share this to spread awareness.